We will be reading Painkiller by Barry Meier. This is a book about the opioid crisis and what happened during it as well, the beginning, and why people should avoid in this case why people should avoid drugs. Yes, very bad drugs like the oxycontin and fentanyl and all these other drugs that people should not be using and should be made illegal. And so this book is going to go over all all of that. It's been 5 months since we've read this last time, and um, so this one, since there is no need for an ambiance, this is a serious topic. Let's go ahead and get into it. And obviously, there is a Netflix series on there if it's still on there. And like I said, I've last time I read this was 5 months ago, and hopefully we can get more of this done. I don't know how much better life I'll have by that at that time, but we will do our best. So without further ado, let us go ahead and start reading Painkiller. Few doctors change how medicine is practiced, but Russell K. Portenoy was about to join that select group. By 2000, he had emerged as the superstar of a growing medical movement to use powerful narcotics, such as Oxycontin, to treat chronic pain more aggressively. In his mid 40s, he was already recognized as one of the leading specialists in this area. His reputation as an innovative speaker, researcher, and thinker had grown so quickly that a major New York City hospital, the Beth Israel Medical Center, had created a pain department expressly to lure him there. Over the previous 2 decades, Portenoy had written or co-authored more than 100 scientific articles about pain treatment and contributed to at least 12 books. At least 12 books. His confidence and quick, easy wit made him a popular speaker at scientific conferences and medical conventions. These qualities also made him a sought-after consultant for pharmaceutical companies that were producing and marketing pain medications. He appeared on television programs and was frequently quoted in newspaper and magazine articles about pain treatment. 20 years earlier, at the beginning of his career, pain treatment as a specialty barely existed. In 1981, when he was a new resident at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine, he was introduced to the hospital's teaching staff, who took turns describing their areas of expertise. After one physician said his focus was pain treatment, Portenoy smiled, thinking the man was joking. "You can't do pain," replied Portenoy, who has a long face with a neatly trimmed beard. "Pain isn't a disease, it's a symptom." 2 decades later, the demands on his time were so great that patients often waited for 4 months to get an appointment to see him. Those who made it through his doors inhabited a particular circle of, of Hades known as chronic non-malignant pain, or intense pain that from causes other than cancer. Severe ongoing pain often accompanies cancer, as growing malignant tumors press against sensitive nerves or destroy bone. Recurring episodes of serious pain can also be hallmarks of diseases such as a sickle cell, anemia, diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, and shingles. For many of Portenoy's patients, however, pain thrived as though it had a life of its own, outlasting the injury or illness that had first caused it. This pain often proved resistant to treatment. In these patients, it was as if the nervous system had gone haywire, spewing out a constant stream of signals to the brain that translated as an unrelenting scream of pain. Chronic pain is an umbrella term for conditions that have different causes and symptoms. In some patients, a minor injury like a twisted ankle or the breaking of a tiny wrist bone might cause a leg or an arm to swell, sweat, discolor, and even become pal- palsied. In other patients, severe pain leapt from limb to limb without apparent reason, as though it were playing a game of hide and seek. Some patients experience bolts of phantom pain, seemingly emanating from a limb long severed from their bodies. Others were rendered nauseous, speechless, or prostrate by migraine headaches, cluster headaches, or trigeminal, trigeminal, the neuralgia, a condition in which intense, ripping pain sporadically explodes along facial nerves. Still, other patients awoke from a surgery or a minor procedure like a cosmetic facelift to find themselves accompanied from that day forward by intense burning pain, as though a doctor's scalpel had nicked a nerve. Many sufferers are consumed by a single idea, finding relief. One of Portnoy's patients, a school custodian, started experiencing mysterious facial pains. At first, he thought the problem would pass, but the episodes continued, and the pain, which started on the right side of his face and traveled across it, intensified to the point of being unbearable. A decade-long medical odyssey began. One doctor gave the man blood pressure medicine. Another one gave him lithium, a drug prescribed for manic depression. He received migraine treatments and started taking fistfuls of Percocet. His condition continued to worsen, and he was forced to stop working. Eventually, one doctor suggested that he might be able to abort the attacks by breathing in oxygen, so he began to travel everywhere with the type of portable oxygen tank that emphysema sufferers use. When he felt an attack coming on, he would press a thumb against the right side of his face and close one nostril with a finger while breathing in oxygen. It helped, but his misery remained so intense that he considered a dentist's recommendation to have some of his teeth removed. The man's son thought he might be suffering from trigeminal neuralgia, the excruciating facial pain condition, and brought his father to see a doctor who claimed to have developed a successful surgical approach to the condition. But that doctor told him he couldn't help because he believed the man was suffering from cluster headaches, a syndrome of unknown cause that often affects middle-aged men and produces intense pain episodes. One day, the man's wife saw a television documentary about pain that featured Portnoy. They managed to get an appointment with Portnoy, and his prescription of a strong dose of Oxycontin put an end to the man's suffering. Oxycontin didn't work this well for all of Portnoy's patients, but he was a firm believer in the value of long-acting narcotics to treat chronic pain, and he kept similar drugs in his armamentarium. One was fentanyl, the powerful synthetic opioid that was marketed by a unit of Johnson & Johnson in the form of a skin patch under the brand name Duragesic. Another long-acting painkiller was methadone, a substance best known as maintenance narcotic for heroin addicts, which started its medical life as a pain treatment. Portnoy, like other pain specialists, used different pharmaceuticals to supplement or amplify the effects of narcotics. Several drugs used to control epilepsy, for instance, also worked to effectively dampen pain. For pain patients, an expert of Portnoy's stature was rarely the first stop. By the time a patient saw him, the person was usually loaded down with years of medical records, x-rays, and diagnostic test results. For Portnoy and specialists like him, deciphering pain was like trying to solve a puzzle. All of this data provide clues to a patient's condition, but the answer was embedded somewhere within the greater jumble of physical, psychological, social, and emotional conditions of each patient. Pain is a little science, a little of intuition, and a lot of art, Portnoy like to say. The most commonplace of medical complaints, pain is also the most subjective, because doctors must rely on patients to describe their pain. Pain can be sharp or dull. It can ache or shoot. It can burn or chill. Some patients describe their pain as mimicking the pounding of a hammer, others as the beating of a drum, and still others as the stabbing of a knife. Each person has a unique pain threshold, the point at which one experiences pain, and people raised in different cultures respond to pain differently. Dr. B. Morris noted in his book The Culture of Pain that a study performed in the 1950s at a veterans hospital in San Francisco found that while Jewish and Italian American patients tended to be uninhibited about expressing pain, patients of Irish or Protestant Anglo Saxon origin were more tight lipped.
You'll need to continue on your iPhone or iPad.
In rare cases, people are born insensitive to pain. What may seem like an inviolable asset is, in fact, a disastrous condition that can cause one to sit calmly on a scalding radiator, oblivious to being severely burned. The most widely cited case involved a Canadian girl referred to in reports as Miss C. In their book, The Challenge of Pain, Dr. Ronald Melzack and Dr. Patrick D. Wall wrote that Miss C's congenital insensitivity to pain caused her to bite off the tip of her tongue. As a young woman, she developed severely infected joints because she was able to stand in poses that others would find excruciating. Miss C succumbed to massive infections when she was 29. It was pain's inscrutability that made it and also ran in the hierarchy of medical specialists. Physicians like problems that they can diagnose and solve, and there is no pain thermometer, pain gauge, or pain meter. A doctor can't send out a patient's blood to find clues about their pain. Technology, be it in the form of an x ray machine or a more advanced device like an MRI scanner, is sometimes helpful but also notoriously unreliable. While 80% of people who complain of back pain have x rays that show evidence of spinal disc degeneration, about 70% of all adults exhibit disc degeneration on x rays and have no pain. The science of measuring pain had made such little progress by the end of the 20th century that one of its key tools was a scale of crude cartoon-like faces ranging from smiling to grimacing. The history of pain management as a modern medical specialty reaches back only to 1973, less than a decade before Portnoy began his residency, and the year that the International Association for the Study of Pain was created at a conference in Seattle, Washington. But physicians, philosophers, priests, and shamans have studied pain and its causes for millennia, trying to understand the roles that the body, the mind, and the emotions play in the cause of pain and its sensation. Many ancient civilizations, such as those in Babylonia, Egypt, and India, believed that pain was experienced in the heart and signaled an emotional unbalance or an invasion of the body by evil and mischievous spirits. It was a Greek scientist named Galen who, in the 2nd century BC, began the first systematic examination of the nervous system. His work was largely forgotten until the Renaissance, when physicians realized that the brain constantly received pain signals, ignoring some and amplifying others. By the late 20th century, scientists had unraveled the secrets of the nervous system even further, discovering specific chemicals that transmitted pain and others that blocked it. There also have been relatively few advances in pain treatment. Opium, which comes from the opium poppy, has been used for thousands of years both to treat pain and to produce pleasure. Through much of history, doctors believed that opium was benign, in part because it was the only medicine available to combat life threatening conditions like uncontrolled diarrhea. In his book Opium, a History, Martin Booth writes that the drug was used during the 19th century in a host of preparations like paregoric and laudanum and sold to combat a host of medical ills, including the ill defined malaise. Opium was also the basis of so called soothing solutions. Potions destitute and overworked Victorian women gave their babies to quiet them. These potions were also used on baby farms, the notorious orphanages of the same period. The opium drinks rendered infants virtually comatose, damaging some for life. It was in the early 19th century that chemists discovered that much of opium's pain killing power came from a substance that they named morphine, after Morpheus, the Greek god of sleep. Morphine's use in medicine soon became more widespread than in opium. Researchers continued to isolate other chemicals from opium, including thebaine, the starting material in the production of oxidone, the active ingredient in drugs such as Percocet and Oxycontin. It had already become apparent by the mid 19th century that opioids carried a price. By 1900, there were an estimated 300,000 morphine addicts in the United States, including many Civil War veterans who had gotten addicted to the painkiller while being treated for war related injuries or illnesses. The condition was so commonplace it was called soldier's disease. Finally, around World War I, the medical profession recognized morphine's intense, habit forming potential, and the term addiction began to be widely used. Physicians now viewed narcotic drugs as carrying a high risk of so called iatrogenic addiction, or addiction induced in a patient in the course of treatment by a doctor. Surveys performed in the 1920s of patients in drug addiction treatment programs estimated that 9 to 24% of addicts had first been given narcotics by a physician while being treated for pain. By the start of the 20th century, doctors had another reason to worry. In 1914, the federal government passed the Harrison Act, the nation's first drug law. It was essentially a taxing and record keeping statute. But 5 years after it was passed, in 1919, the U.S. Supreme Court issued an opinion that interested the Harrison Act as also banning the prescribing of narcotics to those addicted to them. By the late 1930s, more than 25,000 doctors had been charged with offenses related to Harrison Act violations. Physicians still employed morphine to treat severe pain, particularly the intense suffering experienced by cancer patients. But medical views about morphine's addictive potential, even near the end of a patient's life, affected how the drug was used and resulted in needless agony for cancer patients. As recently as the early 1990s, many doctors prescribed morphine to cancer patients on a so called PRN basis. Medical shorthand for pro-renata, or as needed, morphine's pain-killing effect typically lasted for 4 hours. So under a PRN-based approach, cancer sufferers were supposed to ask for and receive their next dose of morphine when they felt pain returning. The trouble was that cancer patients didn't immediately get another dose of the drug, even if they begged for it or screamed out in agony. Some doctors and nurses, faced with a patient's desperate demands, heard the prevarications of a suspected drug abuser rather than a cry for help. Because of prevailing medical and social stigmas about narcotics, some medical professionals, as well as some patients, believed that a stiff upper lip was the right approach to pain. Cancer pain treated as needed could escalate so sharply that the amount of morphine necessary to subdue it put a patient into a mental stupor. This horrific situation was the genesis for what became known as the hospice movement. An English physician, Dr. Cicely M. Saunders, was one of its early champions. In 1967, Dr. Saunders opened the first facility, St. Christopher's in London, devoted to the care of those in the final months of life. Her philosophy was that the terminally ill should die a dignified death, not in a sterile hospital, but rather in comfortable surroundings, even one's home. She also believed that life's end should be as pain-free as possible. The hospice movement arrived in the United States in the early 1980s. By then, a few American hospitals, most notably Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York City, had already begun to use morphine more aggressively in cancer care. Experts were that there believed that a cancer patient should be given morphine routinely, not just when it was asked for. In order to avoid the roller coaster effect of the PRN approach, the facility's extensive work with morphine demonstrated that, contrary to accepted medical conventions, cancer patients who received large morphine doses didn't become addicted or experience the type of euphoric high that drug abusers do. In time, the work at hospitals like Sloan Kettering changed the way cancer pain was treated throughout the United States. It also drew attention to what pain experts saw as another, even bigger problem: the inadequate treatment of serious pain unrelated to cancer, or chronic non malignant pain. These patients, who suffered from conditions as diverse as back pain, arthritis, sickle cell anemia, and other problems, made up 80% of those in constant pain, according to some estimates. In the mid 1980s, as Russell Portnoy was beginning his career, pain treatment experts used a variety of methods to treat chronic pain, including surgical procedures, cortisone shots, and alternative approaches such as biofeedback and exercise. There was a furious debate underway about how or even whether narcotics should be used. Many leading pain specialists believed that patients who had chronic pain without a clear origin suffered from a complex mix of physical, psychological, and emotional problems. They were also concerned that a steady regimen of narcotic painkillers for their patients would produce drugged out zombies, drug abusers, or addicts. There was even evidence that narcotics could intensify rather than help some types of pain by suppressing the body's own pain fighting system. Those favoring a non pharmaceutical approach often saw pain patients as head cases who used complaints about pain as a way to get out of work, emotionally manipulate other people, or obtain drugs. The most common pain complaint, lower back pain, was rarely diagnosed by doctors prior to World War II. But by 1980, it accounted for an astonishing 5% of all doctors' visits. This epidemic of back pain, some specialists believed, had less to do with nerve problems or physical injuries than with work-related stress and job dissatisfaction. Researchers theorized that unhappy employees, after sustaining a relatively minor injury, preferred to drag out their sick leave rather than return to work, and that their depression and susceptibility to pain deepened the longer they remained home. Large financial awards from juries or compensation boards were also thought to play a role. After determining that more than half of a group of pain patients involved in lawsuits had pain rooted in emotional causes rather than physical ones, one researcher dubbed the phenomenon chronic pain in litigation. Throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s, many specialists advocated for a multidisciplinary approach to severe pain. Hospital centers based on the method operated at the University of Washington and the University of Miami. Patients entering such programs dropped their painkillers at the door, sometimes by the shopping bag full. Then they were slowly weaned off narcotics to prevent withdrawal and put through a regimen of programs that emphasized physical therapy, psychotherapy, and other techniques, including behavior modification. Patients spent several hours a day doing stretching and strengthening exercises like aerobics and swimming. Since many pain patients suffered from anxiety caused by the anticipation of future attacks, they were taught relaxation and stress management techniques as substitutes for taking tranquilizers, drugs that were also addicting. This was the landscape of pain treatment when Russell Portnoy started his residence in 1981. His mentor, Dr. Ronald Kaner, was a pain treatment activist. He had worked at Memorial Sloan Kettering and believed that many doctors in this country suffered from opiophobia, a term coined by opioid advocates to describe irrational fears about the addictive powers of these drugs. In Portnoy, Kaner saw not only an eager acolyte, but also a world-class researcher, and he quickly threw him into the fray, handing him a Bronx telephone book. He told him to call local druggists and ask what Schedule II narcotics, like morphine, Dilaudid, and Percocets, they kept in stock. It turned out that druggists in the Bronx had few narcotic painkillers available, both because opioids were rarely prescribed and because pharmacists feared robberies. Before long, other doctors were referring pain patients to Portnoy. As he learned about pain in many forms, he observed how difficult it was for patients to get help. One patient, a 35-year-old black man with sickle cell anemia, told Portnoy that each time he suffered an attack, he was forced to go to a hospital and endure hours of pain before a hospital emergency room doctor would give him just a few painkillers. Portnoy wrote him a prescription for Percocet so he would have a ready supply at home. The man broke down and cried, telling Portnoy that no doctor had ever trusted him before. Portnoy began a research fellowship at Memorial Sloan Kettering, the cancer center in Manhattan's Upper East Side. The facility had become the nation's first hospital to open a unit specifically devoted to the treatment of patient pain and had appointed as its head a seminal figure in the field, Dr. Kathleen M. Foley. Some physicians might have found Memorial Sloan Kettering, a hospital where many patients made their last losing stand against cancer, a difficult place to work. Portnoy, who worked as a researcher in Foley's small team, saw it as his job to give comfort. His role, unlike that of an oncologist, wasn't to fight cancer's progress, but to make the lives of its sufferers more bearable. "We were the white hats," he said years later. "We didn't feel we had to battle the disease. We didn't feel we would be defeated. You would walk into a room with a person with cancer that has metastasized, and the family is there to despair. But you would walk out of the room having done something to help." In the mid-1980s, Portnoy and other doctors began to administer a new cancer pain medication called MS Cotton. It was sold by Purdue Frederick, the same company that a decade later would create Purdue Pharma to market OxyContin. MS Cotton was a time-release version of morphine, and cancer specialists liked it because it was long-lasting and because it didn't contain additives such as aspirin or acetaminophen, which can cause intestinal bleeding and liver damage. Portnoy also treated chronic pain patients without cancer, and in 1986 he published a study co-authored by Kathleen Foley that was titled Chronic Use of Opioid Analgesics in Non-Malignant Pain. By research standards, it was a limited study which involved just 38 Memorial Sloan Kettering patients with a mix of pain conditions such as back or facial pain. Both the imprimatur of the famous cancer hospital, its impact was enormous, and the study would serve as the scientific launching pad for Portnoy's career, as well as what became known as the pain management movement. The intent behind the study was compassionate. Portnoy argues in it that there is a subpopulation of chronic pain patients who, having failed to get relief otherwise, might benefit from the long-term use of powerful narcotics, drugs already shown to be safe when used in cancer patients. We conclude that opioid maintenance therapy can be a safe, salutary, and more humane alternative to the options of surgery or no treatment in those patients with intractable non-malignant pain and no history of drug abuse, Portnoy and Foley wrote. Portnoy soon took to the medical lecture circuit to deliver that message, giving talks sponsored by either drug companies or an organization supported by pharmaceutical industry, the Dan Miller Foundation. Initially, his advocacy for increased opioid use wasn't welcome. Experts favoring a multidisciplinary strategy considered him an evangelist for the drug industry. They argued that while powerful narcotics had subdued his patients' pain, few of those patients were actually functioning better. But a new generation of pain specialists had another view. Many of them believed that reducing severe and incessant pain was a laudable goal in itself. And Portnoy, as his reputation grew, drew large crowds. A pain specialist who attended one of his lectures said, "When you are the first person bringing a radical approach, a lot of people want to hear what you have to say." The 1986 study was only a beginning for Portnoy. Over the next few years, he authored a series of follow-up reports that provide both the drug industry and opioid advocates with data to wield as they pushed for the increased use of narcotic painkillers. In his papers, Portnoy argued that the high addiction rates noted by researchers in the 1920s were misleading because they reflected a skewed population, participants in drug treatment programs. Instead, he maintained that when one looked at the experience of pain patients who had received narcotics in medical settings, the addictive risk of the drugs all but disappeared. There was scant data on the subject, but Portnoy pointed to 3 reports to support his claim. In the years that followed, these studies and their supposed findings would be cited hundreds of times by opioid advocates and drug companies and adopted by the pain management movement as a kind of scientific holy trinity. One of those reports had appeared in 1980 in a major medical journal, the New England Journal of Medicine, and reviewed narcotics use and addiction in hospital patients. The second of these studies was published in 1977 in a medical journal, Headache, and looked at the use of narcotic painkillers by chronic headache sufferers. And the third study, which appeared in a 1982 issue of another scientific journal, Pain, reviewed the experience of burn patients given narcotics while undergoing an extremely painful procedure called debridement, in which dead skin is removed from living tissue to allow healing. As characterized by Portnoy, the 3 reports strongly indicated that patients who hadn't abused drugs before faced little, if any, risk when treated with strong opioids like Oxycontin. As he described the hospital study, It had found only 4 cases of addiction among 11,882 hospitalized patients. And he reported that the study of chronic headache sufferers had identified only 3 problem cases among 2,369 patients. There was also a similarly low rate of problems, Portnoy said, among pain patients given opioids before undergoing debridement. Years later, Purdue Pharma and its medical allies would point to these same studies and Portnoy's portrayal of them as the basis for the company's claim that powerful narcotics such as Oxycontin posed an addiction risk to patients of less than 1%. But in fact, the studies, both individually and collectively, did not contain a shred of scientific evidence about the safety of long-term narcotics use. The report from the New England Journal of Medicine, which was portrayed by Portnoy and others as finding only 4 cases of addiction among 11,882 hospitalized patients, wasn't even a study. Instead, the figures were contained in a 1980 letter submitted to the medical publication by 2 researchers, Dr. Herschel Jick and Dr. Jane Porter, who headed an initiative called the Boston Collaborative Drug Surveillance Program, which was intended to better identify the side effects of dozens of different kinds of prescription medications, not just opioids. Their research also had nothing to do with the safety or risks involved with the long-term use of any drugs, because patients were only monitored while they were in the hospital, not afterward. Dr. Jick would say years later that he and Dr. Porter submitted the statistics about narcotics use to the New England Journal of Medicine as a letter because they weren't robust enough to merit a study. He added that one couldn't conclude anything about the risks of long-term narcotics from their study, and that neither Dr. Portnoy nor anyone else had contracted him before using his research to make misleading claims about it. Portnoy and others also mischaracterized the study about migraine sufferers. That research had taken place in Chicago at a facility called the Diamond Headache Clinic and looked at the experience of 2,369 patients treated there. While Portnoy and others claimed that the study had found only 3 problem cases among that large group, that wasn't even close to the facts. Instead, those 3 problem cases had occurred within a much smaller group of patients, 62 of whom were looked at separately because they had taken either painkillers or a combination of painkillers and barbiturates for at least 6 months before coming to the clinic. Those 3 patients represented 5% of that group, and Portnoy, even while touting the headache report, had neglected to cite its conclusion. The study specifically warned against the use of narcotics in headache sufferers and stating, there is a danger of dependency and abuse in patients with chronic headaches. Years later, long after Oxycontin had cut its swath of destruction through places like Lee County, Portnoy would issue a cautious apology about his failure to properly cite the studies. He said that he had wanted to create a narrative that would diminish negative attitudes about opioids and help pain patients receive better care. But during his days as the champion of the pain management movement, his assertion of the safety of long-term opioid use was often unequivocal and unvarnished. There is a growing literature showing that these drugs can be used for a long time with few side effects, and that addiction and abuse are not a problem, he told one newspaper reporter. There is little question that when Portnoy promoted his opioid narrative in the early 1990s, the medical profession needed to change how pain was treated. Many physicians received only an hour of training in medical school about pain and its management. Doctors concerned about the possibility of addiction also resisted prescribing strong opioids. A 1991 survey of state medical board members conducted by researchers at the University of Wisconsin reported that only 12% of board members viewed such treatment as acceptable practice. The way of treating severe pain in some groups of patients, in particular, the elderly and newborns, bordered on the barbaric. Up until the mid 1980s, surgeons operated on desperately ill newborns without using painkillers, because they were considered too risky for infants to tolerate. For years, children in pain were inadequately medicated. Most adults would be shocked if they saw what was done to children in hospitals without anesthetics. One pediatric pain expert told the Los Angeles Times in 1991. Spurred by leaders of the pain management movement, government authorities soon began calling for better care. In 1992, for example, a unit of the Public Health Service called Agency for Healthcare Policy issued new guidelines that urged hospitals to use powerful narcotics more aggressively to treat the type of acute pain experienced as the result of surgery. Dr. James O. Mason, the Public Health Service's top official, said that new recommendations were needed to dispel cultural myths that pain is necessary to build character, that infants do not feel pain, that elderly patients have a higher pain tolerance, and that narcotics used for postoperative pain are often addictive. Opioid advocates also had begun to make slow but steady progress on another critical front, convincing state legislatures or state medical boards, the agencies in each state that license doctors, to encourage a more liberal use of strong painkillers. Beginning with Texas in 1989, a growing number of states passed laws or adopted medical guidelines that specifically recognized the value of powerful narcotics in treating severe chronic pain. Opioid advocates had long argued that new rules were necessary because narcotics agents and medical regulators had unfairly targeted doctors who used large amounts of painkillers. All advocacy movements need good bogeymen, and pain management activists had long identified their enemy as any law, any institution, or any regulatory mechanism that deterred doctors from liberally prescribing opioids. Among those roadblocks, they argued, were databases used by some states to track a physician's dispensing of controlled substances or prescription monitoring systems, as they are known. In the mid-1990s, such systems existed in only 14 states, and law enforcement authorities used them to identify doctors who wrote an unusually high volume of prescriptions for opioids. In some cases, those numbers might simply reflect the nature of a doctor's specialty, but in other cases, a large number of prescriptions for painkillers could be a sign that a physician was running a pill mill. States such as New York, which monitored prescriptions for Schedule II narcotics like morphine and oxycodone, had typically adopted the systems in response to outbreaks of prescription drug abuse. For years, both drug companies and the American Medical Association, the professional group that represents doctors, had fiercely opposed prescription monitoring. But as the pain management movement gathered strength in the early 1990s, opioid advocates took over a leading role in that campaign, arguing that prescription monitoring was having a chilling effect on legitimate prescribing because doctors feared landing on law enforcement's radar. A leading voice opposing monitoring was the head of a think tank at the University of Wisconsin, David E. Joranson, originally called the Pain Treatment Group. The research organization later changed its name to the Pain and Policy Studies Group. Earlier in his career, Joranson had been the administrator of Wisconsin's Controlled Substances Board, where he became involved in the late 1980s in efforts to improve cancer pain care in the state. Soon afterward, he left government and devoted himself to a pain care advocacy, including promoting better care pain treatment in developing countries where taboos against morphine still existed. But in a series of papers in the early 1990s, Joranson argued that prescription monitoring was of little proven law enforcement value and that it was causing doctors to limit writing narcotics prescriptions for patients who needed the drugs. Publicly, Joranson stated he favored an approach to monitoring that balanced the needs of law enforcement and pain patients. But for opioid activists, balance became a word used to mask an agenda. For example, when several states tried to accommodate complaints from physicians about prescription monitoring by switching from paper forms to electronic ones, Joranson opposed that too. Requiring the use of these prescription forms would send an unmistakable message to physicians that prescribing controlled substances could give them an unwanted high profile with the police or licensing authorities if they order more than a minimal amount for patients in pain. Joranson and a co-author wrote in a 1993 issue of a pro-opioid publication, the American Pain Society Bulletin. At the time, some medical experts, such as Dr. Sidney Wolfe of the Health Research Group, an advocacy group critical of the drug industry, argued that there was little evidence to support the claim by Joranson and others that prescription monitoring had a chilling effect on medical practice. By the mid-1990s, the pain management movement was strong enough to defeat a congressional initiative to create a prescription monitoring system at both the state and national levels. By then, the news media was also carrying the movement's message to the public. Within the space of 2 months, during the spring of 1997, U.S. News and World Report published an article entitled "The Quality of Mercy." While Forbes published the morphine myth, some journalists trumpeted the data from the 3 studies that Portnoy cited as showing that narcotics held scant addiction risk for patients, without ever looking to see what the studies really said. Other writers chose to dramatize the battle against pain, describing how medical myths, intrusive regulations, or meddling government drug agents were depriving patients of desperately needed medication. In 1997, Playboy magazine even suggested that the U.S. government, needing a winnable war, had cracked down on doctors' offices. The article continued, "Across the country, state agents allied with the DEA have staked out pain clinics under the assumption that wherever narcotics are prescribed, diversion of the drugs will soon follow. In pursuing this theory, the government has criminalized an entire class of patients and scared doctors into abandoning them." Journalists were missing important stories, however, about the misuse of science and the network of financial ties between the pain management movement and the drug industry. Industry money supported not only research by investigators such as Russell Portnoy, but also the work of consultants and virtually every pain management specialist advocating for increased opioid prescriptions. Drug companies also spent heavily to subsidize patient advocacy groups such as the American Pain Foundation and the 2 principal professional groups representing pain specialists, the American Pain Society, APS, and the American Academy of Pain Medicine, AAPM. In 1997 alone, Purdue Pharma contributed $500,000 to underwrite the work of a joint committee formed by the 2 groups, which issued a report urging the broader medical application of powerful narcotics. Drug companies also funded David Joranson's Pain and Policy Studies Group at the University of Wisconsin. While the group did receive support from some non, some nonprofit organizations, such as the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. The majority of its funding came from such makers of opioids as Janssen Pharmaceuticals, Knoll Pharmaceuticals, and Ortho McNeil. The most generous of these industry donors was Purdue, which gave Joransson's group hundreds of thousands of dollars. Ideological ties between opioid advocates and a company like Purdue were even more powerful than financial ones. Many experts calling for a more aggressive use of narcotics viewed Purdue not as a profit-seeking enterprise, but as an ally in a noble social cause, the betterment of pain treatment. I view them as our colleagues in education, Kathleen Foley, Russell Porton,